Loud and clear now, Mike, and we understand that you are a Dodger.
That's right. Hello, Apollo 11 Houston. We recommend you accept the now 49. Continue through your sequence of sightings, and then we'll analyze the data afterwards. Over.
Okay. Houston, Apollo 11, star 40 has just disappeared now in the sextant. Could the trunnion angle 47 something be a little high?
Stand by. Hello, Apollo 11 Houston. We'd like you to press on to star 44. Over. 11 Houston, we copy. 2 good marks. Over.
Okay.
Plus, correction, 00572. Perigee plus 00085. 00764. 030. 293. 986 minus 0075. Eagle Houston, we lights on. One, 0, vision 10%. Do it, Mike.
Thank you, Neil.
I'll leave it in flu. Relay to us. See if they got me now. I got good signal strength in flu.
Yeah, you should have me now, Houston.
Eagle, we got you now. It's looking good. Over. Eagle, that looks good. Eagle, Houston, everything's looking good here. Over. Roger, copy. Eagle, Houston, after yaw around angles, S-band pitch, -9er, yaw, +18. Copy. Tags and things agree very closely. Roger. Bait on. Altitude's a little high.
Two minutes, 20 seconds, everything looking good. We show altitude about 47,000 feet.
Yeah. Houston, I'm getting a little fluctuation in the AC voltage now. Roger. 50 meter maybe, huh? Stand by. It's looking good to us. You're still looking good at coming up 3 minutes.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Fido.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Ecom.
Go.
Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, we're go for landing. Altitude 4200.
Houston, you're go for landing. Over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. You're looking great.
How you doing, Control?
We look good here, Fido.
How about you, Telcom? Go. Guidance, you happy?
Go.
Fido.
Go. 2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag. 47 degrees. Roger. 47 degrees.
It's still looking very good.
Your go. Not alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
Same time, we're go, flight.
Okay, we're go.
We're go. Same time, we're go.
Altitude 1600.
Eagle looking great. Roger, 1202, we copy it. 35 degrees, 750, over down to 23.
about 30 to 35 feet to 5.
Pretty good little jump. Be advised that the shadow, a little hard for me to see it. I has about 1 foot clearance on the ground. We're
Houston, Columbia.
Columbia, this is Houston. Go ahead, over.
I did see a suspiciously small white object push forward this car.
Go ahead with the coordinates of the small white object.
Easy .37.6, but I'm surely damn it is right on the southwest rim of a crater. I think they would know it if they were in such a location. It looks like their limb would be pitched up quite a degree. It's on the southwest wall of a smallish crater.
Roger, copy. Echo decimal 3 and 7 decimal 6. Very clearly visible. Hopefully no trouble. Okay. And I can see everything quite clearly. The light is sufficiently. And currently it's upside down on our monitor, but we can make out a fair amount of detail. Okay. Also, I'm looking at one now that appears to have, I can see some evidence of rays emanating from Capcom. At the foot of the ladder, the limb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we covered? Yeah, I think so. Well, because we stand by for a minute or so. That works, right? Go ahead. You have uplink, but not through Parks. That's right. You're through Goldstone, uplink site. Neil, this is Houston. Did you copy about the contingency sample over?
I'm sorry. No, not today. I'm going to New York. Sorry. After I got the car back on the road again, I felt like a fool. It's the thought of picking him. After I got the car back on the road again, I felt like a fool. It's the thought of picking him up, of having him sit beside me, somehow unbearable. Yet at the same time, I felt more than ever unspeakably alone. Hour after hour went by. The fields, the towns ticked off one by one. The light changed. I knew now that I was going to see him again. And though I dreaded the sight, I caught myself searching the side of the road, waiting for him to appear.
What is it? What do you want?
You sell sandwiches and pop here, don't you?
Yeah, we do in the daytime, but we're closed for the night.
Well, I know, but I was just wondering if you could possibly let me have a cup of coffee. Black coffee.
My wife's the cook and she's in bed.
Well, now, listen. Just a minute ago, there was a man standing here, right beside here, and a suspicious-looking man.
Who is it, Henry?
It's nobody, Mother. Just a fella thinks he wants a cup of coffee. Thinks he wants a cup of... Just a fella thinks he wants a cup of... Just a fella thinks he wants a cup of... Just a fella thinks he wants a cup of... Just a fella thinks he wants a cup of... Just a fella thinks he wants a cup of...
First, let me make it very clear, poor people aren't necessarily killers. Just because you happen to be not rich doesn't mean you're willing to kill.
The fella thinks he wants a cup of coffee. Go back to bed.
I don't mean to disturb you, but you see, I was driving along when I just happened to look, and there he was.
What was he doing?
Nothing.
Ah, you've been hitting the bottle. That's what's the matter with you. Got nothing better to do than wake decent folks out of their hard-earned sleep.
I was in the heart of the great Texas prairies. There wasn't a car on the road after the truck went by. I was in the heart of the great Texas prairies. There wasn't a car on the road after the truck went. I was in the heart of the great Texas prairies. There wasn't a car on the road after the truck went by. I tried to figure out what to do, how to get a hold of myself. If I could find a place to rest, or even if I could sleep right here in the car, just a few hours, get some sleep just along the side of the road. I was getting my winter overcoat out of the back seat to use as a blanket, just as a blanket, when I saw you coming toward me, emerging from the herd of moving steer.
My whole life I've been a fraud. I'm not exaggerating. Pretty much all I've ever done all the time is try to create a certain impression of me in other people, mostly to be liked or admired. It's a little more complicated than that, maybe. But when you come right down to it, it's to be liked, loved, admired, approved of, applauded, whatever. You get the idea. I did well in school, but deep down the whole thing's motive wasn't to learn or improve myself, but just to do well. To get good grades and make sports teams and perform well. To have a good transcript or varsity letters to show people. I didn't enjoy it much because I was always scared I wouldn't do well enough. The fear made me work really hard, so I'd always do well and end up getting what I wanted. But then once I got the best grade or made all city, or got Angela Meade to let me put my hand on her breast, I wouldn't feel much of anything except maybe fear that I wouldn't be able to get it again, the next time or next thing I wanted. I remember being down in the rec room in Angela Meade's basement on the couch and having her let me get my hand up under her blouse and not even really feeling the soft aliveness or whatever of her breast because all I was doing was thinking, now I'm the guy that Meade let get to second with her. Later that seemed so sad. This was in middle school. She was a very big-hearted, quiet, self-contained, thoughtful girl. She's a veterinarian now with her own practice. And I never even really saw her. I couldn't see anything except who I might be in her eyes. This cheerleader and probably number 2 or 3 among the most desirable girls in middle school that year. She was much more than that. She was beyond all that adolescent ranking and popularity crap, but I never really let her be or saw her as more, although I put up a very good front as somebody who could have deep conversations and really wanted to know and understand who she was inside. Later I was in analysis. I tried analysis like almost everybody else then in their late 20s who'd made some money or had a family or whatever they thought they wanted and still didn't feel that they were happy. A lot of people I knew tried it. It didn't really work, although it did make everyone sound more aware of their own problems and added some useful vocabulary and concepts to the way we all had to talk to each other to fit in and sound a certain way. You know what I mean. I was in regional advertising at the time in Chicago, having made the jump from media buyer for a large consulting firm, and at only 29 I'd made creative associate. And verily, as they say, I was a fair-haired boy and on the fast track, but wasn't happy at all. Whatever happy means. But of course I didn't say this to anybody because it was such a cliche. Tears of a clown, Richard Corey, etc., and the circle of people who seemed important to me seemed much more dry, oblique, and contemptuous of cliches than that. And so, of course, I spent all my time trying to get them to think I was dry and jaded as well, doing things like yawning and looking at my nails, and saying things like, "Am I happy?" is one of those questions that, if it has got to be asked, more or less dictates its own answer, etc. Putting in all this time and energy to create a certain impression and get approval or acceptance that then I felt nothing about, because it didn't have anything to do with who I really was inside. And I was disgusted with myself for always being such a fraud, but I couldn't seem to help it. Here are some of the various things I tried. EST, riding a 10-speed to Nova Scotia and back, hypnosis, cocaine, sacrocervical chiropractic, joining a charismatic church, jogging, pro bono work for the ad council, meditation classes, the Masons, analysis, the Landmark Forum, the Course in Miracles, a right brain drawing workshop, celibacy, collecting and restoring vintage Corvettes, and trying to sleep with a different girl every night for 2 straight months. I racked up a total of 36 for 61, and also got chlamydia, which I told friends about, acting like I was embarrassed, but secretly expecting most of them to be impressed, which, under the cover of making a lot of jokes at my expense, I think they were. But for the most part, the 2 months just made me feel shallow and predatory. Plus, I missed a great deal of sleep and was a wreck at work. That was also the period I tried cocaine. I know this part is boring, and probably boring you, by the way, but it gets a lot more interesting when I get to the part where I kill myself and discover what happens immediately after a person dies. In terms of the list, psychoanalysis was pretty much the last thing I tried. The analyst I saw was okay. A big, soft older guy with a big ginger mustache and a pleasant, sort of informal manner. I'm not sure I remember him alive too well. He was a fairly good listener, and seemed interested and sympathetic in a slightly distant way. At first I suspected he didn't like me, or was uneasy around me. I don't think he was used to patients who were already aware of what their real problem was. He was also a bit of a pill pusher. I balked at trying antidepressants. I just couldn't see myself taking pills to try to be less of a fraud. I said that even if they worked, how would I know if it was me or the pills? By that time, I had already knew I was a fraud. I knew what my problem was. I just couldn't seem to stop. I remember I spent maybe the first 20 times or so in analysis acting all open and candid, but in reality sort of fencing with him, or leading him around by the nose, basically showing him that I wasn't just another one of those patients who stumbled in with no clue what their real problem was, or who were totally out of touch with the truth about themselves. When you come right down to it, I was trying to show him that I was at least as smart as he was, and that there wasn't much of anything he was going to see about me that I hadn't already seen and figured out. And yet I wanted help, and really was there to try to get help. I didn't even tell him how unhappy I was until 5 or 6 months into the analysis, mostly because I didn't want to seem like just another whining, self-absorbed yuppie, even though I think, even then, I was on some level conscious that that's all I really was, deep down. Right from the start, what I liked best about the analyst was that his office was a mess. There were books and papers every place, and usually he had to clear things off the chair so I could sit down. There was no couch. I sat in an easy chair, and he sat facing me in his beat-up old desk chair, whose back part had one of those big rectangles, or capes, of back massage beads attached to it, the same way cabbies often put them on their seat in the cab. This was another thing I liked, the desk chair and the fact that it was a little too small for him, and he was not a small guy, so that he had to sit sort of almost hunched with his feet flat on the floor, or else sometimes he'd put his hands behind his head and lean way back in the chair in a way that made the back portion squeak terribly when it leaned back. There always seemed to be something patronizing or a little condescending about somebody crossing their legs when they talked to you, and the desk chair didn't allow him to do this. If he ever crossed his legs, his knee would have been up around his chin. And yet he had apparently never gone out and gotten himself a bigger or nicer desk chair, or even bothered to oil the medial joint springs to keep the back from squeaking, a noise that I know would have driven me up the wall if it had been my chair, and I had to spend all day in it. I noticed all this almost right away. The little office also reeked of pipe tobacco, which is a pleasant smell. Plus, Dr. Gustafsson never took notes or answered everything with a question, or any of the cliché analyst things that would have made the whole thing too horrible to keep going back, whether it even helped or not. The whole effect was a sort of likable, disorganized, laid-back guy. and things in there actually did get better after I realized that he probably wasn't going to do anything to make me quit fencing with him, and trying to anticipate all his questions so I could show that I already knew the answer. He was going to get his $65 either way, and finally came out and told him about being a fraud and feeling alienated. I had to use the uptown word, of course, but it was still the truth, and starting to see myself ending up living this way for the rest of my life and being completely unhappy. I told him I wasn't blaming anybody for my being a fraud. I had been adopted unhappy. I told him I wasn't blaming anybody for my being a fraud. I had been adopted, but it was as a baby. I told him I wasn't blaming anybody for my being a fraud. I had been adopted unhappy. I told him I wasn't blaming anybody for my being a fraud. I had been adopted unhappy. I told him I wasn't blaming anybody for my being a fraud. I had been adopted, but it was as a baby, and the step-parents who adopted me were better and nicer than most of the biological parents I knew anything about. And I was never yelled at, or abused, or pressured to hit 400 in Legion Ball, or anything. And they took out a second mortgage to send me to an elite college when I could have gone scholarship to UW Eau Claire, etc. nobody had ever done anything bad to me. Every problem I ever had, I'd been the cause of. I was a fraud, and the fact that I was lonely was my own fault. Of course his ears pricked up at fault, which is a loaded term, because I seemed to be so totally self-centered and fraudulent that I experienced everything in terms of how it affected people's view of me and what I needed to do to create the impression of me I wanted them to have. I said I knew what my problem was. What I couldn't do was stop it. I also admitted to Dr. Gustafsson some of the ways I'd been jerking him around early on and trying to make sure he saw me as smart and self-aware, and said I'd known early on that playing around and showing off an analysis were a waste of time and money, but that I couldn't seem to help myself. It just happened automatically. He smiled at all this, which was the first time I remember seeing him smile. I don't mean he was sour or humorless. He had a big red friendly face and a pleasant enough manner, but this was the first time he'd smiled like a human being having an actual conversation. And yet at the same time, I already saw what I'd left myself open for, and sure enough, he says it. "If I understand you right," he says, "you're saying that you're basically a calculating, manipulative person who always says what you think will get somebody to approve of you or form some impression of you think you want." I told him that was maybe a little simplistic, but basically accurate. And he said further that as he understood it, I was saying that I felt as if I was trapped in this false way of being and unable ever to be totally open and tell the truth, irregardless of whether it made me look good in others' eyes or not. And I somewhat resignedly said yes, and that I seemed always to have had this fraudulent, calculating part of my brain firing away all the time, as if I were constantly playing chess with everybody and figuring out that if I wanted them to move a certain way, I had to move in such a way as to induce them to move that way. He asked if I ever played chess, and I told him that I used to in middle school, but quit, because I couldn't be as good as I eventually wanted to be. How frustrating it was to get just good enough to know what getting really good at it would be like, but not being able to get that good, etc. I was laying it on sort of thick in hopes of distracting him from the big insight and question I realized I'd set myself up for, but it didn't work. He leaned back in his loud chair and paused as if he were thinking hard for effect. He was thinking that he was going to get to feel like he'd really earned his $65 today. Part of the pause always involved stroking his mustache in an unconscious way. I was reasonably sure that he was going to say something like, "So then how were you able to do what you just did a moment ago?" In other words, meaning how was I able to be honest about the fraudulence if I was really a fraud, meaning he thought he'd caught me in some kind of logical contradiction or paradox. And I went ahead and played a little dumb, probably, to get him to go ahead and say it. Partly because I still held out some hope that what he'd say might be more discerning or incisive than I had predicted. But it was also partly because I liked him, and liked the way he seemed genuinely pleased and excited at the idea of being helpful, but was trying to exercise professional control over his facial expression in order to make the excitement look more like simple pleasantness and clinical interest in my case or whatever. He was hard not to like. He had what is known as an engaging manner. By way of decor, the office wall behind the chair had two framed prints, one being that Wyeth one of the little girl in the wheat field crawling uphill towards the farmhouse. The other a still life of two apples in a bowl on a table by Cézanne. To be honest, I only knew it was Cézanne because it was an Art Institute poster and had a banner with info on a Cézanne show underneath the painting, which was a still life, and which was weirdly discomfiting because there was something slightly off about the perspective or style that made the table look crooked and the apples look almost square. The prints were obviously there to give the analyst patients something to look at, since many people like to look around or look at things on the wall while they talk. I didn't have any trouble looking right at him most of the time I was in there, though. He did have a talent for putting you at ease, there was no question about it, but I had no illusions that this was the same as having enough insight or firepower to find some way to really help me, though. There was a basic logical paradox that I called the fraudulence paradox, that I had discovered more or less on my own while taking a mathematical logic course in school. I remember this as being a huge undergrad lecture course that met twice a week in an auditorium with the professor up on stage, and on Fridays in smaller discussion sections led by a graduate assistant whose whole life seemed to be mathematical logic. Plus, all you had to do to ace the class was sit down with the assigned textbook that the prof was the editor of and memorize the different modes of argument and normal forms and axioms of first-order quantification. Meaning the course was as clean and mechanical as logic itself, in that if you put in the time and effort, out popped the good grade at the other end. We only got to paradoxes like the Berry and Russell paradoxes and the incompleteness theorem at the very end of the term. They weren't on the final. The fraudulence paradox was that the more time and effort you put in trying to appear impressive or attractive to other people, the less impressive or attractive you felt inside. You were a fraud. And the more of a fraud you felt like, the harder you tried to convey an impressive or likable image of yourself so that other people wouldn't find out what a hollow, fraudulent person you really were. Logically, you would think that the moment a supposedly intelligent 19-year-old became aware of this paradox, he'd stop being a fraud and just settle for being himself, whatever that was, because he'd figured out that being a fraud was a vicious, infinite regress that ultimately resulted in being frightened, lonely, alienated, etc. But here was the other, higher-order paradox, which didn't even have a form or name. I couldn't. Discovering the first paradox at age 19 just brought home to me in spades what an empty, fraudulent person I'd basically been ever since at least the time I was 4 and lied to my stepdad because I'd realized somehow, right in the middle of his asking me if I'd broken the bowl, that if I said I did it but confessed it in a sort of clumsy, implausible way, then he wouldn't believe me and would instead believe that my sister Fern, who's my step-parents' biological daughter, was the one who'd actually broken the antique Moser glass bowl that my stepmom had inherited from her biological grandmother and totally loved. Plus it would lead or induce him to see me as a kind, good stepbrother who was so anxious to keep Fern, whom I really did like, from getting in trouble that I'd be willing to lie and take the punishment for it for her. I'm not explaining this very well. I was only 4 for one thing, and the realization didn't hit me in words the way I just now put it, but rather more in terms of feelings and associations and certain mental flashes of my step-parents' faces with various expressions on them. But it happened that fast, at only 4, that I figured out how to create a certain impression by knowing what effect I'd produce in my stepdad by implausibly confessing that I'd punched Fern in the arm and stolen her hula hoop and had run all the way downstairs with it and started hula hooping in the dining room right by the sideboard with all my stepmom's antique glassware and figurines on it, while Fern, forgetting all about her arm and hoop because of her concern over the bowl and other glassware, came running downstairs shouting after me, reminding me about how important the rule was that we weren't supposed to play in the dining room. Meaning that by lying in such a deliberately unconvincing way, I could actually get everything that a direct lie would supposedly get me, plus look noble and self-sacrificing, plus also make my step-parents feel good, because they always tended to feel good when one of their kids did something that showed character, because it's the sort of thing they couldn't really help but see as reflecting favorably on them as shapers of their kids' character. I'm putting all this in such a long, rushing, clumsy way to try to convey the way I remember it suddenly hitting me, looking up at my stepfather's big, kindly face as he held 2 of the larger pieces of the Moser bowl and tried to look angrier than he really felt. He had always thought the more expensive pieces ought to be kept secure in storage somewhere, whereas my stepmom's view was more like what was the point of having nice things if you didn't have them out where people could enjoy them. How to appear a certain way and get him to think a certain thing hit me just that fast. Keep in mind I was only around 4, and I can't pretend it felt bad, realizing it. The truth is, it felt great. I felt powerful, smart. It felt a little like looking at part of a puzzle you're doing, and you've got a piece in your hand and you can't see where in the larger puzzle it's supposed to go, or how to make it fit, looking at all the holes, and then all of a sudden, in a flash you see, for no reason right then you could point to or explain to anyone, that if you turn the piece this one certain way it will fit, and it does. And maybe the best way to put it is that in one tiny instant, you feel suddenly connected to something larger and much more of the complete picture the same way the piece is. The only part I'd neglected to anticipate was Fern's reaction to getting blamed for the bowl, and then punished even worse when she continued to deny that she'd been the one playing around at the dining room. And my step-parents' position was that they were even more upset and disappointed about her lying than they were about the bowl, which they said was just a material object and not ultimately important in the larger scheme of things. My step-parents spoke this way. They were people of high ideals and values, humanists. Their big ideal was total honesty in all the family's relationships, and lying was the worst, most disappointing infraction you could commit in their view as parents. They tended to discipline Fern a little more firmly than they did me, by the way, but this too was an extension of their values. They were concerned about being fair and having me be able to feel that I was just as much their real child as Fern was, so that I'd feel maximally secure and loved. And sometimes this concern with fairness caused them to bend a little too far over backward when it came to discipline. So that Fern, then, got regarded as being a liar when she was not, and that must have hurt her way more than the actual punishment did. She was only 5 at the time. It's horrible to be regarded as a fraud, or to believe that people think you're a fraud or liar. It's possibly one of the worst feelings in the world. And even though I haven't really had any direct experience with it, I'm sure it must be doubly horrible when you are actually telling the truth and they didn't believe you. I don't think Fern ever quite got over that episode, although the two of us never talked about it afterward, except for one sort of cryptic remark she made over her shoulder once, when we were both in high school and having an argument about something, and Fern was storming out of the house. She was sort of a classically troubled adolescent, smoking, makeup, mediocre grades, dating older guys, etc., whereas I was the family's fair-haired boy and had a killer GPA and played varsity ball, etc. One way to put it is that I looked and acted much better on the surface then than Fern did, although she eventually settled down and ended up going on to college and is now doing okay. She's also one of the funniest people on earth, with a very dry, subtle sense of humor. I like her a lot. The point being that that was the start of my being a fraud, although it's not as if the broken bowl episode was somehow the origin or cause of my fraudulence, or some kind of childhood trauma that I'd never gotten over and had to go into analysis to work out. The fraud part of me was always there, just as the puzzle piece, objectively speaking, is a true piece of the puzzle even before you see how it fits. For a while, I thought that possibly one or the other of my biological parents had been frauds, or had carried some type of fraud gene or something, and that I had inherited it, but that was a dead end, and there was no way to know. And even if I did, what difference would it make? I was still a fraud. It was still my own unhappiness that I had to deal with. Once again, I'm aware that it's clumsy to put it all this way, but the point is that all of this and more was flashing through my head just in the interval of the small, dramatic pause Dr. Gustafsson allowed himself before delivering his big reductio ad absurdum argument that I couldn't be a total fraud if I had just come out and admitted my fraudulence to him just now. I know that you know as well as I do how fast thoughts and associations can fly through your head. You can be in the middle of a creative meeting at your job or something, and enough material can rush through your head just in the little silences when people are looking over their notes and waiting for the next presentation that it would take exponentially longer than the whole meeting just to try to put a few seconds silence's flood of thoughts into words. This is another paradox, that many of the most important impressions and thoughts in a person's life are ones that flash through your head so fast that fast isn't even the right word. They seem totally different from or outside of the regular sequential clock time that we all live by, and they have so little relation to the sort of linear, one word after another word English we all communicate with each other with, that it could easily take a whole lifetime just to spell out the contents of one split second's flash of thoughts and connections, etc. And yet we all seem to go around trying to use English, or whatever language our native country happens to use, it goes without saying, to try to convey to other people what we're thinking, and to find out what they're thinking, when in fact, deep down, everybody knows it's a charade, and that they're just going through the motions. What goes on inside is just too fast and huge and all interconnected for words to do more than barely sketch the outlines of at most one tiny little part of it at any given instant. The internal head speed or whatever of these ideas, memories, realizations, emotions, and so on is even faster, by the way. Exponentially faster, unimaginably faster, when you're dying. Meaning during that vanishingly tiny nanosecond between when you technically die and when the next thing happens. So that in reality, the cliche about people's whole life flashing before their eyes as they're dying isn't all that far off. Although the whole life here isn't really a sequential thing where first you're born, and then you're in the crib, and then you're up at the plate in Legion Ball, etc. Which it turns out that that's what people usually mean when they say, my whole life. Meaning a discrete, chronological series of moments that they add up and call their lifetime. It's not really like that. The best way I can think of to try to say it is that it all happens at once, but that at once doesn't really mean a finite moment of sequential time the way we think of time while we're alive, plus that what turns out to be the meaning of the term my life isn't even close to what we think we're talking about when we say my life. Words and chronological time create all these total misunderstandings of what's really going on at the most basic level. And yet at the same time, English is all we have to try to understand it, and try to form anything larger or more meaningful and true with anybody else, which is yet another paradox. Dr. Gustafsson, whom I would meet again later and find out that he had almost nothing to do with the big, doughy, repressed guy sitting back against his chair's beads in the River Forest office, with colon cancer in him already at that time, and him knowing nothing yet, except that he didn't feel quite right down there in the bathroom lately, and if it kept on, he'd make an appointment to go in and ask his internist about it. Dr. G would later say that the whole my whole life flashed before me phenomenon at the end is more like being a white cap on the surface of the ocean, meaning that it's only at the moment you subside and start sliding back in that you're really even aware there's an ocean at all. When you're up and out there as a whitecap, you might talk and act as if you know you're just a whitecap on the ocean, but deep down you don't think there's really an ocean at all. It's almost impossible to. Or like a leaf that doesn't believe in the tree it's part of, etc. There are all sorts of ways to try to express it. And of course, all this time, you've probably been noticing what seems like the really central, overarching paradox, which is that this whole thing where I'm saying words can't really do it, and time doesn't really go in a straight line, is something that you're hearing as words, that you have to start listening to the first word, and then each successive word after that in chronological time to understand. So if I'm saying that words in sequential time have nothing to do with it, you're wondering why we're sitting here in this car, using words and taking up your increasingly precious time. Meaning, aren't I sort of logically contradicting myself right at the start? Not to mention, am I maybe full of BS about knowing what happens? If I really did kill myself, how can you even be hearing this? Meaning, am I a fraud? That's okay. It doesn't really matter what you think. I mean, it probably matters to you, or you think it does. That isn't what I mean by doesn't matter. What I mean is that it doesn't really matter what you think about me, because despite appearances, this isn't even really about me. All I'm trying to do is sketch out one little part of what it was like before I died and why I at least thought I did it, so that you'll have at least some idea of why what happened afterwards happened and why it had the impact it did on who this is really about. Meaning it's like an abstract or sort of intro, meant to be very brief and sketchy, and yet of course look how much time in English it's seeming to take even to say it. It's interesting if you really think about it. How clumsy and laborious it seems to be to convey even the smallest thing. How much time would you even say has passed so far? One reason why Dr. Gustafsson would have made a terrible poker player or fraud is that whenever you thought it was a big moment at the analysis, he would always make a production of leaning back in his desk chair, which made that loud sound as the back tilted back and his feet went back on their heels so the soles showed. Although he was good at making the position look comfortable and very familiar to his body. Like it felt good doing that when he had to think. The whole thing was both slightly overdramatic and yet still likable for some reason. Fern, by the way, has reddish hair and slightly asymmetrical green eyes. The kind of green people buy tinted contact lenses to get, and is attractive in a sort of witchy way. I think she's attractive, anyway. She's grown up to be a very poised, witty, self-sufficient person, with maybe just the slightest whiff of the perfume of loneliness that hangs around unmarried women around age 30. The fact is that we're all lonely, of course. Everyone knows this. It's almost a cliché. So yet another layer of my essential fraudulence is that I pretended to myself that my loneliness was special, that it was uniquely my fault because I was somehow especially fraudulent and hollow. It's not special at all. We've all got it. In spades. Dead or not, Dr. Gustafsson knew more about all this than I, so that he spoke with what came off as genuine authority and pleasure when he said, maybe a little superciliously, given how obvious it was, "But if you're constitutionally false and manipulative, and unable to be honest about who you really are, Neil," Neil being my given name, it was on my birth certificate when I got adopted, "how is it that you were able to drop the sparring and manipulation and be honest with me a moment ago?" For that's all it had been, in spite of all the English that's been expanded on just my head's partial contents in the tiny interval between then and now. About who you really are. So it turned out I'd been right in predicting what his big logical insight was going to be. And although I played along with him for a while so as not to prick his bubble, inside I felt pretty bleak indeed, because now I knew that he was going to be just as pliable and credulous as everyone else. He didn't appear to have anything close to the firepower I'd need to give me any hope of getting helped out of the trap of fraudulence and unhappiness I'd constructed for myself. Because the real truth was that my confession of being a fraud and of having wasted time sparring with him over the previous weeks in order to manipulate him into seeing me as exceptional and insightful had itself been kind of manipulative. It was pretty clear that Dr. Gustafsson, in order to survive in private practice, could not be totally stupid or obtuse about people, so it seemed reasonable to assume that he'd noticed the massive amount of fencing and general showing off I'd been doing during the first few weeks of the analysis, and thus had come to some conclusions about my apparently desperate need to make a certain kind of impression on him. And though it wasn't totally certain, it was thus at least a decent possibility that he'd sized me up as a basically empty, insecure person whose whole life involved trying to impress people and manipulate their view of me in order to compensate for the inner emptiness. It's not as if this is an incredibly rare or obscure type of personality, after all. So the fact that I had chosen to be supposedly honest and to diagnose myself aloud was in fact just one more move in my campaign to make sure Dr. Gustafsson understood that as a patient, I was uniquely acute and self-aware, and that there was very little chance he was going to see or diagnose anything about me that I wasn't already aware of and able to turn to my own tactical advantage in terms of creating whatever image or impression of myself I wanted him to see at that moment. His big supposed insight, then, which had as its ostensible first-order point that my fraudulence could not possibly be as thoroughgoing and hopeless as I claimed it was, since my ability to be honest with him about it logically contradicted my claim of being incapable of honesty, actually had as its larger unspoken point the claim that he could discern things about my basic character that I myself could not see or interpret correctly, and thus that he could help me out of the trap by pointing out inconsistencies in my view of myself as totally fraudulent. The fact that this insight that he appeared so coyly pleased and excited about was not only obvious and superficial, but also wrong. This was depressing. Much the way that discovering that somebody is easy to manipulate is always a little depressing. A corollary to the fraudulence paradox is that you simultaneously want to fool everyone you meet, and yet also somehow always hope that you'll come across someone who is your match or equal and can't be fooled. But this was sort of the last straw. I mentioned I'd tried a whole number of different things that hadn't worked already, so depressing is a gross understatement, actually. Plus, of course, the obvious fact that I was paying this guy for help in getting out of the trap, and he'd now showed that he didn't have the mental firepower to do it. So I was now thinking about the prospect of spending time and money driving into River Forest twice a week just to yank the analyst around in ways he couldn't see so that he'd think that I was actually less fraudulent than I thought I was, and that analysis with him was gradually helping me see this. Meaning that he'd probably be getting more out of it than I would. For me, it would just be fraudulence as usual. However tedious and sketchy all this is, you're at least getting an idea, I think, of what it was like inside my head. If nothing else, you're seeing how exhausting and solipsistic it is to be like this. And I had been this way my whole life, at least from age 4 onward, as far as I could recall. Of course, it's also a really stupid and egotistical way to be. Of course you can see that. This is why the ultimate and most deeply unspoken point of the analyst's insight, namely, that who and what I believed I was not what I really was at all, which I thought was false, was in fact true, although not for the reasons that Dr. Gustafsson, who was leaning back in his chair and smoothing his big mustache with his thumb and forefinger while I played dumb and let him feel like he was explaining to me a contradiction I couldn't understand without his help, believed. One of my other ways of playing dumb for the next several sessions after that was to protest his upbeat diagnosis. Irrelevantly, since by this time I'd pretty much given up on Dr. Gustafsson and was starting to think of various ways to kill myself without causing pain or making a mess that would disgust whoever found me, by means of listing the various ways I'd been fraudulent, even in my pursuit of ways to achieve genuine and uncalculating integrity. I'll spare giving you the whole list again. I basically went all the way back to childhood, which analysts always like you to do, and laid it on. Partly, I was curious to see how much he'd put up with. For example, I told him about going from genuinely loving ball, loving the smell of the grass and distant sprinklers, or the feel of pounding my fist into the glove over and over and yelling, "Hey, batter, batter," and the big, low, red, tumid sun of the game's start versus the arc lights coming on with a clank in the glowing twilight of the late innings, and of the steam and clean-burned smell of ironing my Legion uniform, or the feel of sliding and watching all the dust it raised settle around me, or all the parents in shorts and rubber flip-flops setting up lawn chairs with styrofoam coolers, little kids hooking their fingers around the backstop fence or running off after fouls, the smell of the ump's aftershave and sweat, the little whisk broom he'd bend down and tidy the plate with, mostly the feel of stepping up to the plate knowing anything was possible, a feeling like a sun flaring somewhere high up in my chest, and about how by only maybe 14 all that had disappeared and turned into worrying about averages and if I could make all city again, or being so worried I'd screw up that I didn't even like ironing the uniform anymore before games because it gave me too much time to think. Standing there so nerved up about doing well that night that I couldn't even notice the little chuckling sighs the iron made anymore, or the singular smell of the steam when I hit the little button for steam. How I'd basically ruined all the best parts of everything like that. How sometimes it felt like I was actually asleep and none of this was even real, and someday out of nowhere, I was maybe going to suddenly wake up in mid-stride. That was part of the idea behind things like joining the charismatic church up in Naperville, to try to wake up spiritually instead of living in this fog of fraudulence. The truth shall set you free. The Bible. This was what Beverly Elizabeth Slane liked to call my holy roller phase, and the charismatic church really did seem to help a lot of the parishioners and congregants I met. They were humble and devoted and charitable, and gave tirelessly without thought of personal reward in active service to the church, and in donating resources and time to the church's campaign to build a new altar with an enormous cross of thick glass, whose crossbeam was lit up and filled with aerated water, and was to have various kinds of beautiful fish swimming in it, fish being a prominent Christ symbol for charismatics. In fact, most of us who were the most devoted and active in the church had bumper stickers on our cars with no words or anything, except a plain line drawing of the outline of a fish. This lack of ostentation impressed me as classy and genuine. But with the real truth here being how quickly I went from being someone who was there because he wanted to wake up and stop being a fraud, to being somebody who was so anxious to impress the congregation with how devoted and active I was that I volunteered to help take the collection, and never missed one study group the whole time, and was on 2 different committees for coordinating fundraising for the new aquarial altar and deciding exactly what kind of equipment and fish would be used for the crossbeam. Plus often being the one in the front row whose voice in the responses was loudest, and who waved both hands in the air the most enthusiastically to show that the Spirit had entered me, and speaking in tongues, mostly consisting of D's and G's, except not really, of course, because in fact I was really just pretending to speak in tongues, because all the parishioners around me were speaking in tongues and had the Spirit, and so in a kind of fever of excitement I was able to hoodwink even myself into thinking that I really had the Spirit moving through me and was speaking in tongues, when in reality I was just shouting, "Dugga-muggle urgle durgle," over and over. In other words, so anxious to see myself as truly born again, that I actually convinced myself that the tongue's babble was real language, and somehow less false than plain English at expressing the feeling of the Holy Spirit rolling like a juggernaut right through me. This went on for about 4 months. Not to mention falling over backward whenever Pastor Steve came down the row popping people and popped me in the forehead with the heel of his hand, but falling over backwards on purpose, not genuinely being struck down by the Spirit like the other people on either side of me, one of whom actually fainted and had to be brought around with salts. It was only when I was walking out to the parking lot one night after Wednesday night praise that I suddenly experienced a flash of self-awareness or clarity or whatever, in which I suddenly stopped conning myself and realized that I'd been a fraud all these months in the church too, and was really only saying and doing these things because all the real parishioners were doing them, and I wanted everyone to think I was sincere. It just about knocked me over. That was how vividly I saw how I'd deceived myself. The revealed truth was that I was an even bigger fraud in church about being a newly reborn, authentic person than I'd been before Deacon and Miss Halberstadt first rang my doorbell out of nowhere as part of their missionary service and talked me into giving it a shot. Because at least before the church thing, I wasn't conning myself. I'd known that I was a fraud since at least age 19, but at least I'd been able to admit and face the fraudulence directly, instead of BSing myself that I was something I wasn't. All this was presented in the context of a very long pseudo-argument about fraudulence with Dr. Gustafsson that would take way too much time to relate to you in detail, so I'm just telling you about some of the more garish examples. With Dr. G, it was more in the form of a prolonged, multi-session back and forth on whether or not I was a total fraud, during which I got more and more disgusted with myself for even playing along. By this point in the analysis, I'd pretty much decided he was an idiot, or at least very limited in his insights into what was really going on with people. There was also the blatant issue of the mustache and of him always playing with it. Essentially, he saw what he wanted to see, which was just the sort of person I could practically eat for lunch in terms of creating whatever ideas or impressions of me I wanted. For instance, I told him about the period of trying jogging, during which I seemed never to fail to have to increase my pace and pump my arms more vigorously whenever someone drove by or looked up from his yard, so that I ended up with bone spurs and eventually had to quit altogether, or spending at least 2 or 3 sessions recounting the example of the introductory meditation class at the Downers Grove Community Center that Melissa Betts of Settlement Dorn got me to take, at which through sheer force of will, I'd always force myself to remain totally still with my legs crossed and back perfectly straight long after the other students had all given up and fallen back on their mats, shuddering and holding their heads. Right from the first class meeting, even though the small, brown instructor had told us to shoot for only 10 minutes of stillness at the outset, because most Westerners' minds could not maintain more than a few minutes of stillness and mindful concentration without feeling so restless and ill at ease that they couldn't stand it, I always remained absolutely still and focused on breathing my prana with the lower diaphragm longer than any of them, sometimes for up to 30 minutes, even though my knees and lower back were on fire, and I had what felt like swarms of insects crawling all over my arms and shooting out the top of my head. And Master Gurpreet, although he kept his facial expression inscrutable, gave me a deep and seemingly respectful bow and said that I sat almost like a living statue of mindful repose, and that he was impressed. The problem was that we were also all supposed to continue practicing our meditation on our own at home between classes, and when I tried to do it alone, I couldn't seem to sit still and follow my breath for more than even a few minutes before I felt like crawling out of my skin and had to stop. I could only sit and appear quiet and mindful, and withstand the unbelievably restless and horrible feelings when all of us were doing it together in the class, meaning only when there were other people to make an impression on. And even in class, the truth was that I was often concentrating not so much on following my prana as on keeping totally still and in the correct posture and having a deeply peaceful and meditative expression on my face in case anyone was cheating and had their eyes open and was looking around. Plus also to ensure that Master Gurpreet would continue to see me as exceptional and keep addressing me by what became sort of his class nickname for me, which was the Statue. Finally, in the final few class meetings, when Master Gurpreet told us to sit still and focus for only as long as we comfortably could, and then waited almost an hour before finally hitting his small bell with a little silver thing to signal the period of meditation's end, only I and an extremely thin, pale girl who had her own meditation bench that she brought to class with her were able to sit still and focus for the whole hour, although at several different points I'd get so cramped and restless, with what felt like bright blue fire going up my spine and shooting invisibly out of the top of my head as blobs of color exploded over and over again behind my eyelids, that I thought I was going to jump up screaming and take a header right out the window. And at the end of the course, when there was also an opportunity to sign up for the next session, which was called Deepening the Practice, Master Gurpreet presented several of us with different honorary certificates, and mine had my name and the date and was inscribed in black calligraphy. Champion Meditator, Most Impressive Western Student, The Statue. It was only after I fell asleep that night. I'd finally sort of compromised and told myself I was practicing the meditative discipline at home at night by lying down and focusing on following my breathing very closely as I fell asleep, and it did turn out to be a phenomenal sleep aid. That while I was asleep, I had the dream about the statue in the Commons and realized that Master Gurpreet had actually in all likelihood seen right through me the whole time, and that the certificate was in reality a subtle rebuke or joke at my expense, meaning he was letting me know that he knew I was a fraud, and not even coming close to actually quieting my mind's ceaseless conniving about how to impress people in order to achieve mindfulness and honor my true inner self. Of course, what he seemed not to have divined was that in reality I actually seemed to have no true inner self, and that the more I tried to be genuine, the more empty and fraudulent I ended up feeling inside, which I told nobody about until my stab at analysis with Dr. Gustafsson. In the dream, I was in the town commons in Aurora, over near the Pershing Tank Memorial by the clock tower, and what I'm doing in the dream is sculpting an enormous marble or granite statue of myself, using a huge iron chisel and a hammer the size of those ones they give you to try to hit the bell at the top of the big thermometer-like thing at carnivals. And when the statue's finally done, I put it up on a big bandstand or platform and spend all my time polishing it and keeping birds from sitting on it or doing their business on it, and cleaning up litter and keeping the grass neat all around the bandstand. And in the dream, my whole life flashes by like that. The sun and moon go back and forth across the sky like windshield wipers over and over, and I never seem to sleep or eat or take a shower. The dream takes place in dream time, as opposed to waking chronological time, meaning I'm condemned to a whole life of being nothing but a sort of custodian to the statue. I'm not saying it was subtle or hard to figure out. Everybody from Fern, Master Gurpreet, the anorexic girl with her own bench, and Ginger Manley, to people from the firm and some of the media reps we bought time from — I was still a media buyer at this time — all walk by. some several times. At one point, Melissa Betts and her new fiancé even spread out a blanket and have sort of a little picnic in the shade of the statue, but none of them ever look over or say anything. It's obviously another dream about fraudulence, like the dream where I'm supposedly a big pop star on stage, but all I really do is lip sync to one of my step-parents' old Mamas and Papas records that's on a record player just off stage, and somebody whose face I can't ever look over long enough to make out keeps putting his hand in the area of the record as if he's going to make it skip or scratch, and the whole dream makes my skin crawl. These dreams were obvious. They were warnings from my subconscious that I was hollow and a fraud, and that it was only a matter of time before the whole charade fell apart. Another of my stepmother's treasured antiques was a silver pocket watch of her maternal grandfather's, with the Latin Respis Finum inscribed on the inside of the case. It wasn't until after she passed away and my stepfather said she'd wanted me to have it that I bothered to look up the term, after which I'd gotten the same sort of crawly feeling as with Master Gurpreet's certificate. Much of the nightmarish quality of the dream about the statue was due to the way the sun raced back and forth across the sky and the speed with which my whole life blew by like that in the commons. It was obviously also my subconscious enlightening me as to the meditation instructors having seen through me the whole time, after which I was too embarrassed even to go try to get a refund for the deepening the practice class, which there was now no way I felt like I could show up for, even though at the same time I also still had fantasies about Master Gurpreet becoming my mentor or guru and using all kinds of inscrutable Eastern techniques to show me the way to meditate myself into having a true self, etc., etc. I'll spare you any more examples. For instance, I'll spare you the literally countless examples of my fraudulence with girls, with the ladies, as they say, in just about every dating relationship I ever had, or the almost unbelievable amount of fraudulence and calculation involved in my career. Not just in terms of manipulating the consumer and manipulating the client into trusting that your agency's ideas are the best way to manipulate the consumer, but in the inter-office politics of the agency itself. Like, for example, in sizing up what sorts of things your superiors want to believe, including the belief that they're smarter than you, and that that's why they're your superior. And then giving them what they want, but doing it just subtly enough that they never get a chance to view you as a sycophant or yes man, which they want to believe they do not really want, but instead see you as a tough-minded, independent thinker who from time to time bows to the weight of their superior intelligence and creative firepower, etc. The whole agency was one big ballet of fraudulence and of manipulating people's images of your ability to manipulate images, a virtual hall of mirrors. And I was good at it, remember? I thrived there. It was the sheer amount of time Dr. Gustafsson spent touching and smoothing his mustache that indicated he wasn't aware of doing it, and in fact was subconsciously reassuring himself that it was still there, which is not an especially subtle habit in terms of insecurity, since after all, facial hair is known as a secondary sex characteristic, meaning what he was really doing was subconsciously reminding himself that something else was still there, if you know what I mean. This was some of why it was no real surprise when it turned out that the overall direction he wanted the analysis to proceed in involved issues of masculinity, and how I understood my masculinity. My manhood, in other words. This also helped explain everything from the lost female crawling and two testicle-shaped objects that looked deformed prints on the wall to the little African or Indian drum things and little figurines with, sometimes, exaggerated sex characteristics on the shelf over his desk. Plus the pipe, the unnecessary size of his wedding band, even the somewhat overdone little boy clutter of the office itself. It was pretty clear that there were some major sexual insecurities, and maybe even homosexual-type ambiguities, that Dr. Gustafsson was subconsciously trying to hide from himself and reassure himself about. And one obvious way he did this was to sort of project his insecurities onto his patients and get them to believe that America's culture had a uniquely brutal and alienating way of brainwashing its males from an early age into all kinds of damaging beliefs and superstitions about what being a so-called real man was, such as competitiveness instead of concert, winning at all costs, dominating others through intelligence or will, being strong, not showing your true emotions, depending on others seeing you as a real man in order to reassure yourself of your manhood, seeing your own value solely in terms of accomplishments, being obsessed with your career or income, feeling as if you were constantly being judged or on display, etc. This was later in the analysis, after the seemingly endless period where after every example of fraudulence I gave him, he'd make a show of congratulating me on being able to reveal what I felt were shameful, fraudulent examples, and said that this was proof that I had much more of an ability to be genuine than I, apparently because of my insecurities or male fears, seemed able to give myself credit for. Plus, it didn't exactly seem like a coincidence that the cancer he was even then harboring was in his colon, that shameful, dirty, secret place right near the rectum, with the idea being that using your rectum or colon to secretly harbor an alien growth was a blatant symbol both of homosexuality and of the repressive belief that its open acknowledgement would equal disease and death. Dr. Gustafsson and I both had a good laugh over this one after we'd both died and were outside linear time and in the process of dramatic change. You can bet on that. Outside time is not just an expression or manner of speaking, by the way. By this time in the analysis, I was playing with him the way a cat does with a hurt bird. If I'd had an ounce of real self-respect, I would have stopped and gone back to the Downers Grove Community Center and thrown myself on Master Gurpreet's mercy, since except for maybe one or two girls I dated, he was the only one who'd appear to see all the way through to the core of my fraudulence. Plus his oblique, very dry way of indicating this to me betrayed a sort of serene indifference to whether I even understood that he saw right through me that I found incredibly impressive and genuine. Here in Master Gurpreet was a man with, as they say, nothing to prove. But I didn't. Instead, I more or less conned myself into sticking with going in to see Dr. G twice a week for almost 9 months. Toward the end, it was only once a week because by then the cancer had been diagnosed and he was getting radiation treatments every Tuesday and Thursday. Telling myself that at least I was trying to find some venue in which I could get help finding a way to be genuine and stop manipulating everybody around me to see the statue as erect and impressive, etc. Nor, however, is it strictly true that the analyst had nothing interesting to say, or that he didn't sometimes provide helpful models or angles for looking at the basic problem. For instance, it turned out that one of his basic operating premises was the claim that there were really only two basic fundamental orientations a person could have toward the world. 1, love, and 2, fear, and that they couldn't coexist. Or, in logical terms, that their domains were exhaustive and mutually exclusive, or that their two sets had no intersection but their union comprised all possible elements, or that, for all of x, f of x implies not L of x, and L of x implies not f of x, and not for all x, there exists f of x and not L of x. Meaning in other words that each day of your life was spent in service to one of these masters or the other, and one cannot serve two masters, the Bible again. And that was one of the worst things about the conception of competitive, achievement-oriented masculinity that America's supposedly hardwired into its males was that it caused a more or less constant state of fear that made genuine love next to impossible. That is, that what passed for love in American men was usually just the need to be regarded in a certain way, meaning that today's males were so constantly afraid of not measuring up, Dr. G's phrase, with evidently no pun intended, that they had to spend all their time convincing others of their masculine validity, which happens to also be a term from formal logic, in order to ease their own insecurity, making genuine love next to impossible. Although it seemed a little bit simplistic to see this fear as just a male problem, try watching a girl stand on a scale sometime. It turns out that Dr. Gustafsson was very nearly right in this concept of the two masters, though not in the way that he, when alive and confused about his own real identity, believed. And even while I played along by pretending to argue or not quite understand what he was driving at, the idea struck me that maybe the real root of my problem was not fraudulence, but a basic inability to really love, even to genuinely love my step-parents, or Fern, or Melissa Betts, or Ginger Manley of Aurora West High in 1979, whom I'd often thought of as the only girl I'd ever truly loved. Though Dr. G's bromide about men being brainwashed to equate love with accomplishment or conquest also applied here. The plain truth was that Ginger Manley was just the first girl I ever went all the way with, and most of my tender feelings about her were really just nostalgia for the feeling of immense cosmic validation I'd felt when she finally let me take her jeans all the way off and put my so-called manhood inside her, etc. There's really no bigger cliche than losing your virginity and later having all kinds of retrospective tenderness for the girl involved. Or what Beverly Elizabeth Slane, a research technician I used to see outside of work when I was a media buyer and had a lot of conflict with towards the end, said, which I don't think I ever told Dr. G about, fraudulence-wise, probably because it cut a little too close to the bone. Toward the end, she had compared me to some piece of ultra-expensive new medical or diagnostic equipment that can discern more about you in one quick scan than you could ever know about yourself. But the equipment doesn't care about you. You're just a sequence of processes and codes. What the machine understands about you doesn't actually mean anything to it, even though it's really good at what it does. Beverly had a bad temper combined with some serious firepower. She was not someone you wanted to have pissed off at you. She said she'd never felt the gaze of someone so penetrating, discerning, and yet totally empty of care, like she was a puzzle or problem I was figuring out. She said it was thanks to me that she discovered the difference between being penetrated and really known versus penetrated and just violated. Needless to say, these thanks were sarcastic. Some of this was just her emotional makeup. She found it impossible to really end a relationship unless all bridges were burned, and things got said that were so devastating that there could be no possibility of a rapprochement to haunt her or prevent her moving on. Nevertheless, it penetrated. I never did forget what she said in that letter. Even if being fraudulent and being unable to love were in fact ultimately the same thing, a possibility that Dr. Gustafsson never seemed to consider no matter how many times I set him up to see it. Being unable to really love was at least a different model or lens through which to see the problem. Plus, initially it seemed like a promising way of attacking the fraudulence paradox in terms of reducing the self-hatred part that reinforced the fear and the consequent drive to try to manipulate people into providing the very approval I denied myself. Dr. G's term for approval was validation. This period was pretty much the zenith of my career in analysis, and for a few weeks, during a couple of which I actually didn't see Dr. Gustafsson at all because some sort of complication in his illness required him to go into the hospital. And when he came back, he appeared to have lost not only weight, but some kind of essential part of his total mass, and no longer seemed too large for his old desk chair, which still squeaked but now not as loudly. Plus a lot of the clutter and papers had been straightened up and put in several brown cardboard banker's boxes against the wall under the two sad prints, and when I came back in to see him, the absence of mess was especially disturbing and sad for some reason. It was true that I felt some of the first genuine hope I'd had since the early, self-deluded part of the experiment with Naperville's Church of the Flaming Sword of the Redeemer. And yet at the same time, these weeks also led more or less directly to my decision to kill myself, although I'm going to have to simplify and linearize a great deal of interior stuff in order to convey to you what actually happened. Otherwise, it would take an almost literal eternity to recount it. We already agreed about that. It's not that words or human language stop having any meaning or relevance after you die, by the way. It's more the specific, one after the other temporal ordering of them that does, or doesn't. It's hard to explain. In logical terms, something expressed in words will still have the same cardinality, but no longer the same ordinality. All the different words are still there, in other words, but it's no longer a question of which one comes first. Or you could say it's no longer the series of words, but now more like some limit toward which the series converges. It's hard not to want to put it in logical terms, since they're the most abstract and universal, meaning they have no connotation. You don't feel anything about them. Or maybe imagine everything anybody on Earth ever said or even thought to themselves all getting collapsed and exploding into one large, combined, instantaneous sound, although instantaneous is a little misleading, since it implies other instants before and after, and it isn't really like that. It's more like the sudden internal flash when you see or realize something. A sudden flash or whatever of epiphany or insight. It's not just that it happens way faster than you could break the process down and arrange it into English, but that it happens on a scale in which there isn't even time to be aware of any sort of time at all in which it's happening. The flash. All you know is that there's a before and an after, and afterward, you're different. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just trying to give it to you from several different angles. It's all the same thing. Or you could think of it as being more a certain configuration of light than a word sum or series of sounds too, afterward, which is in fact true. Or as a theorem's proof, because if a proof is true, then it's true everywhere and all the time, not just when you happen to say it. The thing is that it turns out that logical symbolism really would be the best way to express it, because logic is totally abstract and outside what we think of as time. It's the closest thing to what it's really like. That's why it's the logical paradoxes that really drive people nuts. A lot of history's great logicians have ended up killing themselves. That is a fact. And keep in mind, this flash can happen anywhere, at any time. Here's the basic Barry paradox, by the way, if you might want an example of why logicians with incredible firepower can devote their whole lives to solving these things and still end up beating their heads against the wall. This one has to do with big numbers, meaning really big, past a trillion, past 10 to the trillion, way up there. When you get way up there, it takes a while even to describe numbers this big in words. The quantity 1,403,000,000,000 to the trillionth power takes 20 syllables to describe, for example. You get the idea. Now, even higher up there in these huge cosmic scale numbers, imagine now the very smallest number that can't be described in under 22 syllables. The paradox is that the very smallest number that can't be described in under 22 syllables, which of course is itself a description of this number, only has 21 syllables in it, which of course is under 22 syllables. So now what are you supposed to do? At the same time, what actually led to it in causal terms, though, occurred during maybe the 3rd or 4th week after Dr. G was back seeing patients after his hospitalization. Although I'm not going to pretend that the specific incident wouldn't strike most people as absurd or even sort of insipid as causes go. The truth is just that late at night, one night in August after Dr. G's return, when I couldn't sleep, which happened a lot ever since the cocaine period, and was sitting up drinking a glass of milk or something and watching television, flipping the remote almost at random between different cable stations, the way you do when it's late. I happened on part of an old Cheers episode from late in the series run where the analyst character, Frasier, who went on to have his own show, and Lilith, his fiancée, and also an analyst, are just entering the stage set of the underground tavern, and Frasier is asking her how her workday at her office went, and Lilith says, "If I have one more yuppie come in and start whining to me about how he can't love, I'm going to throw up." This line got a huge laugh from the show's studio audience, which indicated that they, and so by demographic extension, the whole national audience at home as well, recognized what a cliché and melodramatic type of complaint the inability to love concept was. And sitting there, when I suddenly realized that once again I'd managed to con myself, this time into thinking that this was a truer or more promising way to conceive of the problem of fraudulence, and by extension, that I'd also somehow deluded myself into almost believing that poor old Dr. Gustafsson had anything in his mental arsenal that could actually help me, and that the real truth was probably more that I was continuing to see him partly out of pity, and partly so that I could pretend to myself that I was taking steps to become more authentic, when in fact all I was doing was jerking a gravely ill shell of a guy around and feeling superior to him because I was able to analyze his own psychological makeup so much more accurately than he could analyze mine. The flash of realizing all this at the very same time that the huge audience laugh showed that nearly everybody in the United States had probably already seen through the complaint's inauthenticity as long ago as whenever the episode had originally run. All this flashed through my head in the tiny interval it took to realize what I was watching and to remember who the characters of Frasier and Lilith even were, meaning maybe half a second at most. And it more or less destroyed me. That's the only way I can describe it. As if whatever hope of any way out of the trap I'd made for myself had been blasted out of midair or laughed off the stage. As if I were one of those stock comic characters who is always both the butt of the joke and the only person not to get the joke. And in sum, I went to bed feeling as fraudulent, befogged, hopeless, and full of self-contempt as I'd ever felt. And it was the next morning after that I woke up having decided I was going to kill myself and end the whole farce. As you'll probably recall, Cheers was an incredibly popular series, and even in syndication its metro numbers were so high that if a local advertiser wanted to buy time on it, the slots cost so much that you pretty much had to build his whole local strategy around those slots. I'm compressing a huge amount of what took place in my psyche that next to last night, all the different realizations and conclusions I reached as I lay there in bed unable to sleep or even move. No single series line or audience laugh is in and of itself going to constitute a reason for suicide, of course. Although to you I imagine it probably doesn't seem all that compressed at all. You're thinking here's this guy going on, and why doesn't he get to the part where he kills himself, and explain or account for the fact that he's sitting here next to me in a piece of high-powered machinery telling me all this if he died in 1991. Which in fact I knew I would from the moment I first woke up. It was over. I decided to end the charade. After breakfast, I called in sick to work and stayed home the whole day by myself. I knew that if I was around anyone, I'd automatically lapse into fraudulence. I had decided to take a whole lot of Benadryl, and then just as I got really sleepy and relaxed, I'd get the car up to top speed on a rural road way out in the extreme west suburbs and drive it head-on into a concrete bridge abutment. Benadryl makes me extremely foggy and sleepy. It always has. I spent most of the morning on letters to my lawyer and CPA, and brief notes to the creative head and managing partner who had originally brought me aboard at Samietti and Chain. Our creative group was in the middle of some very ticklish campaign preparations, and I wanted to apologize for in any way leaving them in the lurch. Of course, I didn't really feel all that sorry. Samietti and Chain was a ballet of fraudulence, and I was well out of it. The note was probably ultimately just so that the people who really mattered at S&C would be more apt to remember me as a decent, conscientious guy who it turned out was maybe just a little too sensitive and tormented by his personal demons. Almost too good for this world is what I seemed to be unable to keep from fantasizing a lot of them saying after news of it came through. I did not write Dr. Gustafsson a note. He had his own share of problems, and I knew that in the note I'd spend a lot of time trying to seem as if I was being honest, but really just dancing around the truth, which was that he was a deeply repressed homosexual or androgyne and had no real business charging patients to let him project his own maladjustments onto them, and that the truth was that he'd be doing himself and everybody else a favor if he'd just go over to Garfield Park and blow somebody in the bushes and try to honestly decide if he liked it or not, and that I was a total fraud for continuing to drive all the way into River Forest to see him and bat him around like a catnip toy, while telling myself there was some possible non-fraudulent point to it. All of which, of course, even if they weren't dying of colon cancer right in front of you, you still can never actually come out and say to somebody, since certain truths might well destroy them. And who has that right? I did spend almost 2 hours before taking the first of the Benadryl composing a handwritten note to my sister Fern. In the note, I apologized for whatever pain my suicide and the fraudulence and or inability to love that had precipitated it might cause her and my stepdad, who is still alive and well and now lived in Marin County, California, where he taught part-time and did community outreach with Marin County's homeless. I also used the occasion of the letter and all the sort of last testament urgency associated with it to license apologizing to Fern about manipulating my step-parents into believing that she'd lied about the antique glass bowl in 1967, as well as for half a dozen other incidents and spiteful or fraudulent actions that I knew had caused her pain and that I had felt bad about ever since, but had never really seen any way to broach with her or express my honest regret for. It turns out that there are things you can discuss in a suicide note that would just be too bizarre if expressed in any other kind of venue. Just one example of such was an incident during a period in the mid-70s when Fern, as part of puberty, underwent some physical changes that made her look chunky for a year or two. Not fat, but wide-hipped and bosomy, and sort of much more broad than she'd been as a preteen. And of course she was very, very sensitive about it. Puberty also being a time of terrible self-consciousness and sensitivity about one's body image, obviously. So much so that my step-parents took great pains never to say anything about Fern's new breath, or even ever to bring up any topics related to eating habits, diet and exercise, etc. And I, for my own part, never said anything about it either, not directly. But I had worked out all kinds of very subtle and indirect ways to torment Fern about her size in such a way that my step-parents never saw anything, and I could never really be accused of anything that I couldn't then look all around myself with a shocked, incredulous facial expression as if I had no idea what she was talking about, such as just a quick raise of my eyebrow when her eyes met mine as she was having a second helping at dinner, or a quick little quiet, "You sure you can fit into that?" when she came home from the store with a new skirt. The one I still remembered the most vividly involved the second-floor hall of our house, which was in Aurora and was a 3-story home, including the basement, but not all that spacious or large, meaning a skinny 3-decker like so many you always see, all crammed together along residential streets in Naperville and Aurora. The second-floor hallway, which ran between Fern's room and the top of the stairway on one end and my room and the second-floor bathroom on the other, was cramped and somewhat narrow, but not anywhere close to as narrow as I would pretend that it was whenever Fern and I passed each other in it, with me squashing my back against the hallway wall and splaying my arms out and wincing as if there would be barely enough room for somebody of her unbelievable breadth to squeeze past me, and she would never say anything or even look at me when I did it, but would just go on past me into the bathroom and close the door, but I knew it must have hurt her. A little while later, she entered an adolescent period where she hardly ate anything at all, and smoked cigarettes and chewed several packs of gum a day, and used a lot of makeup. For a while, she got so thin that she looked angular and a bit like an insect, although of course I never said that. And I once, through their bedroom's keyhole, overheard a brief conversation in which my stepmother said she was worried because she didn't think Fern was having her normal time of the month anymore because she had gotten so underweight, and she and my stepfather had discussed the possibility of taking her to see some kind of specialist. That period passed on its own, but in the letter I told Fern that I'd always remembered this and certain other periods when I'd been cruel or tried to make her feel bad, and that I regretted them very much, although I said I wouldn't want to seem so egotistical as to think that a simple apology could erase any of the hurt I'd caused her when we were growing up. On the other hand, I also assured her that it wasn't as if I had gone around for years carrying excessive guilt or blowing these incidents out of all proportion. They were not life-altering traumas or anything like that, and in many ways, they were probably all too typical of the sorts of cruelties that kids tend to inflict on each other growing up. I also assured her that neither these incidents nor my remorse about them had anything to do with my killing myself. I simply said, without going into anything like the level of detail I've given you, because my purpose in the letter was of course very different, that I was killing myself because I was an essentially fraudulent person who seemed to lack either the character or the firepower to find a way to stop, even after I'd realized my fraudulence and the terrible toll it exacted. I told her nothing about the various different realizations or paradoxes. What would be the point? I also inserted that there was also a good possibility that, when all was said and done, I was nothing but just another fast-track yuppie who couldn't love, and that I found the banality of this unendurable, largely because I was evidently so hollow and insecure that I had a pathological need to see myself as somehow exceptional or outstanding at all times. Without going into much explanation or argument, I also told Fern that if her initial reaction to these reasons for my killing myself was to think that I was being much, much too hard on myself, then she should know that I was already aware that that was the most likely reaction my note would produce in her, and had probably deliberately constructed the note to, at least in part, prompt just that reaction. Just the way my whole life I'd often said and done things designed to prompt certain people to believe that I was a genuinely outstanding person whose personal standards were so high that he was far too hard on himself, which in turn made me appear attractively modest and unsmug, and was a big reason for my popularity with so many people in all different avenues of my life. What Beverly Elizabeth Slane had termed my talent for ingratiation, but was nevertheless basically calculated and fraudulent. I also told Fern that I loved her very much, and asked her to relay these same sentiments to Marin County for me. Now we're getting to the part where I actually kill myself. This occurred at 9:17 p.m. on August 19th, 1991, if you want the time fixed precisely. Plus, I'll spare you most of the last couple hours' preparations and back-and-forth conflict and dithering, which there was a lot of. Suicide runs so counter to so many hardwired instincts and drives that nobody in his right mind goes through with it without going through a great deal of internal back-and-forth, intervals of almost changing your mind, etc. The German logician Kant was right in this respect. Human beings are all pretty much identical in terms of our hardwiring. Although we are seldom conscious of it, we are all basically just instruments or expressions of our evolutionary drives, which are themselves the expressions of forces that are infinitely larger and more important than we are, although actually being conscious of this is a whole different matter. So I won't really even try to describe the several different times that day when I sat in my living room and had a furious mental back and forth about whether to actually go through with it. For one thing, it was intensely mental and would take an enormous amount of time to put into words. Plus it would come off as somewhat cliché or banal, in the sense that many of the thoughts and associations were basically the same sorts of generic things that almost anyone who's confronting imminent death will end up thinking. As in, this is the last time I will ever tie my shoe. This is the last time I will look at this rubber tree on top of the stereo cabinet. How delicious this lungful of air right here tastes. This is the last glass of milk I'll ever drink. What a totally priceless gift this totally ordinary sight of the wind picking trees' branches up and moving them around is. Or, I will never again hear the plaintive sound of the fridge going on in the kitchen. The kitchen and breakfast nook are right off my living room, etc. Or, I won't see the sun come up tomorrow or watch the bedroom gradually undim and resolve, etc. And at the same time trying to summon the memory of the exact way the sun comes up over the humid fields and the wet-looking I-55 ramp that lay due east of my bedroom's sliding glass door in the morning. It had been a hot, wet August, And if I went through with killing myself, I wouldn't ever get to feel the incremental cooling and drying that starts here around mid-September, or to see the leaves turn or hear them rustle along the edge of the courtyard outside S&C's floor of the building on S. Dearborn, or see snow or put a shovel and bag of sand in the trunk, or bite into a perfectly ripe, ungrainy pear, or put a piece of toilet paper on a shaving cut, etc. If I went in and went to my bathroom and brushed my teeth, it would be the last time I did those things. I sat there and thought about that, looking at the rubber tree. Everything seemed to tremble a little, the way things reflected in water will tremble. I watched the sun begin to drop down over the townhouse developments going up south of Darien's corporation limit on Lilycash Road, and realized that I would never see the newest home's construction and landscaping completed, or that the home's white insulation wrap with the trade name Tyvek all over it, flapping in all the wind out here, would one day have vinyl siding or plate brick and color-coordinated shutters over it, and I wouldn't see this happen or be able to drive by and know what was actually written there under all the nice exteriors. Or the breakfast nook windows view of the big farm's fields next to my development, with the plowed furrows all parallel so that if I lean and line their lines up just right, they seem to all rush together towards the horizon as if shot out of something huge. You get the idea. Basically, I was in that state in which a man realizes that everything he sees will outlast him. As a verbal construction, I know that's a cliché. As a state in which to actually be, though, it's something else, believe me. Where now every moment takes on a kind of ceremonial aspect. The very sacredness of the world as seen. The same kind of state Dr. G will try to describe with analogies to oceans and whitecaps and trees. You might recall I mentioned this already. This is literally about 1/1,000,000,000th of the various thoughts and internal experiences I underwent in those last few hours, and I'll spare both of us recounting any more, since I'm aware it ends up seeming somewhat lame, which in fact it wasn't, but I won't pretend it was fully authentic or genuine either. A part of me was still calculating, performing, and this was part of the ceremonial quality of that last afternoon. Even as I wrote my note to Fern, for instance, expressing sentiments and regrets that were real, a part of me was noticing what a fine and sincere note it was, and anticipating the effect on Fern of this or that heartfelt phrase, while yet another part was observing the whole scene of a man in a dress shirt and no tie, sitting at his breakfast nook writing a heartfelt note on his last afternoon alive. The blonde-wood table surface trembling with sunlight, and the man's hands steady, and face both haunted by regret and ennobled by resolve. This part of me sort of hovering above and just to the left of myself, evaluating the scene, and thinking what a fine and genuine-seeming performance in a drama it would make if only we all had not already been subject to countless scenes just like it in dramas ever since we first saw a movie or read a book, which somehow entailed that real scenes like the one of my suicide note were now compelling and genuine only to their participants, and to anyone else would come off as banal and even somewhat cheesy or maudlin, which is somewhat paradoxical when you consider, as I did, sitting there at the breakfast nook, that the reason scenes like this will seem stale or manipulative to an audience is that we've already seen so many of them in dramas, and yet the reason we've seen so many of them in dramas is that the scenes really are dramatic and compelling and let people communicate very deep, complicated emotional realities that are almost impossible to articulate in any other way. And at the same time, still another facet or part of me realizing that from this perspective, my own basic problem was that at an early age, I'd somehow chosen to cast my lot with my life's drama's supposed audience, instead of with the drama itself, and that I, even now, was watching and gauging my supposed performance's quality and probable effects, and thus was in the final analysis of the very same manipulative fraud writing the note to Fern that I had been throughout the life that had brought me to this climactic scene of writing and signing it and addressing the envelope and affixing postage and putting the envelope in my shirt pocket, totally conscious of the resonance of it resting there next to my heart in the scene, planning to drop it in a mailbox on the way out to Lilycash Road, and the bridge abutment into which I planned to drive my car at speeds sufficient to displace the whole front end and impale me on the steering wheel and instantly kill me. Self-loathing is not the same thing as being into pain or a lingering death. If I was going to do it, I wanted it instant. On Lilycash, the bridge abutments and side steep banks support State Route 4, also known as the Braidwood Highway, as it crosses overhead on a cement overpass so covered with graffiti that most of it you can't even read, which sort of defeats the purpose of graffiti in my opinion. The abutments themselves are just off the road and about as wide as this car, Plus the intersection is isolated way out in the countryside around Romeoville, 10 or so miles south of the southwest suburbs limits. It is the true boonies. The only homes are farms set way back from the road and embellished with silos and barns, etc. At night in the summer, the dew point is high and there's always fog. It's farm country. I've never once passed under 4 here without seeming to be the only thing on either road. The corn high and the fields like a green ocean all around, insects the only real noise. Driving alone under creamy stars and a little cocked scythe of moon, etc. The idea was to have the accident and whatever explosion and fire was involved occur someplace isolated enough so that no one else would see it, so that there would be as little an aspect of performance to the thing as I could manage, and no temptation to spend my last few seconds trying to imagine what impression the sight and sound of the impact might make on someone watching. I was partly concerned that it might be spectacular and dramatic, and might look as if the driver was trying to go out in as dramatic a way as possible. This is the sort of shit we waste our lives thinking about. The ground fog tends to get more intense by the second, until it seems that the whole world is just what's in your headlight's reach. High beams don't work in fog, they only make things worse. You can go ahead and try them, but you'll see what happens. All they do is light up the fog so it seems even denser. That's kind of a minor paradox, that sometimes you can actually see farther with low beams than high. Alright, and there's a construction and all the flapping Tyvek wrap on houses that if you really do it, you'll never see anyone live in. Although it won't hurt, it really will be instant, I can tell you that much. The field's insects are almost deafening. If the corn's high like this and you watch as the sun sets, you can practically watch them rise up out of the fields, like some great figure shadow rising. Mostly mosquitoes, I don't know what all they are. It's a whole insect universe in there that none of us will ever see or know anything about. Plus you'll notice the Benadryl doesn't help all that much once you're underway. That whole idea was probably ill-conceived. Alright, now we're coming to what I promised and led you through the whole dull synopsis of what led up to this in hopes of. Meaning what it's like to die, what happens, right? This is what everyone wants to know. And you do, trust me. Whether you decide to go through with it or not, whether I somehow talk you out of it the way you think I'm going to try to do or not. It's not what anyone thinks, for one thing. The truth is, you already know what it's like. You already know the difference between the size and speed of everything that flashes through you and the tiny, inadequate bit of it all you can ever let anyone know. As though inside you is this enormous room full of what seems like everything in the whole universe at one time or another, and yet the only parts that get out have to somehow squeeze out through one of those tiny keyholes you see under the knob in older doors, as if we are all trying to see each other through these tiny keyholes. But it does have a knob. The door can open. But not in the way you think. But what if you could? Think for a second. What if all the infinitely dense and shifting worlds of stuff inside you every moment of your life turned out now to be somehow fully open and expressible afterward? After what you think of as you has died. Because what if afterward now each moment itself is an infinite sea or span or passage of time in which to express or convey it? And you don't even need any organized English. You can, as they say, open the door and be in anyone else's room in all your own multiform forms and ideas and facets. Because listen, we don't have much time. Here's where Lilycash slopes slightly down and the banks start getting steep, and you can just make out the outlines of the unlit sign for the farm stand that's never open anymore, the last sign before the bridge. So listen, what exactly do you think you are? The millions and trillions of thoughts, memories, juxtapositions, even crazy ones like this, you're thinking, that flash through your head and disappear? Some sum or remainder of these? Your history? Do you know how long it's been since I told you I was a fraud? Do you remember you were looking at the Respicam watch hanging from the rear view and seeing the time, 9:17? What are you looking at right now? Coincidence? What if no time has passed at all? One clue that there's something not quite real about sequential time the way you experience it is the various paradoxes of time supposedly passing and of a so-called present that's always unrolling into the future and creating more and more past behind it. As if the present were this car, nice car by the way, and the past is the road we've just gone over, and the future is the headlit road up ahead we haven't yet gotten to, and time is the car's forward movement, and the precise present is the car's front bumper as it cuts through the fog of the future, so that it's now, and then a tiny bit later a whole different now, etc. Except if time is really passing, how fast does it go? At what rate does the present change? See? Meaning if we use time to measure motion or rate, which we do, it's the only way you can, 95 miles per hour, 70 heartbeats a minute, etc., how are you supposed to measure the rate at which time moves? 1 second per second? It makes no sense. You can't even talk about time flowing or moving without hitting up against paradox right away. So think for a second. What if there's really no movement at all? What if this is all unfolding in the one flash you call the present? This first, infinitely tiny split second of impact when the speeding car's front bumper's just starting to touch the abutment, just before the bumper crumples and displaces the front end, and you go violently forward, and the steering column comes back at your chest as if shot out of something enormous. Meaning that what if in fact this now is infinite and never really passes in the way your mind is supposedly wired to understand pass? So that not only your whole life, but every single humanly conceivable way to describe and account for that life has time to flash like neon shaped into those connected cursive letters that business signs and windows love so much to use through your mind, all at once in the literally immeasurable instant between impact and death, just as you start forward to meet the wheel at a rate no belt ever made could restrain. The end. The truth is, you've already heard this, that this is what it's like, that it's what makes room for the universes inside you, all the endless, inbent fractals of connection and symphonies of different voices, the infinities you can never show another soul. And you think it makes you a fraud? The tiny fraction anyone else ever sees? Of course you're a fraud. Of course what people see is never you. And of course you know this. And of course you try to manage what part they see if you know it's only a part. Who wouldn't? It's called free will, Sherlock. But at the same time, it's why it feels so good to break down and cry in front of others, or to laugh, or speak in tongues, or chant in Bengali. It's not English anymore. It's not getting squeezed through any hole. So cry all you want. I won't tell anybody. But it wouldn't have made you a fraud to change your mind. It would be sad to do it because you think you somehow have to. It won't hurt, though. It will be loud, and you'll feel things, but they'll go through you so fast that you won't even realize you're feeling them. Which is sort of like the paradox I used to bounce off Gustafsson. Is it possible to be a fraud if you aren't aware you're a fraud? And the very brief moment of fire you'll feel will be almost good, like when your hands are cold, and there's a fire, and you hold your hands out toward it. The reality is that dying isn't bad, but it takes forever. And that forever is no time at all. I know that sounds like a contradiction, or maybe just wordplay. What it really is, it turns out, is a matter of perspective. The big picture, as they say, in which the fact is that this whole seemingly endless back and forth between us has come and gone and come again in the very same instant that Fern stirs a boiling pot for dinner, and your stepfather packs some pipe tobacco down with his thumb, and Angela Meade uses an ingenious little catalog tool to roll cat hair off her blouse, and Melissa Betts inhales to respond to something she thinks her husband just said, and David Wallace blinks in the midst of idly scanning class photos from his 1980 Aurora West High School yearbook, and seeing my photo and trying, through the tiny little keyhole of himself, to imagine what all must have happened to lead up to my death in the fiery single-car accident he'd read about in 1991. Like what sorts of pain or problems might have driven the guy to get in his electric blue Corvette and try to drive with all that OTC medicine in his bloodstream. David Wallace happening to have a huge and totally unorganizable set of inner thoughts, feelings, memories, and impressions of this little photos guy a year ahead of him in school, with a seemingly almost neon aura around him all the time, of scholastic and athletic excellence and popularity and success with the ladies, as well as of every last cutting remark or even tiny disgusted gesture or expression on this guy's part whenever David Wallace struck out looking in Legion Ball or said something dumb at a party, and of how impressive and authentically at ease in the world the guy always seemed, like an actual living person instead of the dithering, pathetically self-conscious outline or ghost of a person David Wallace knew himself back then to be. Verily a fair-haired, fast-track guy whom in the very best human tradition David Wallace had back then imagined as happy and unreflective and wholly unhaunted by voices telling him that there was something deeply wrong with him that wasn't wrong with anybody else, and that he had to spend all of his time and energy trying to figure out what to do and say in order to impersonate an even marginally normal or acceptable U.S. male. All this stuff clanging around in David Wallace 81's head every second and moving so fast that he never got a chance to catch hold and try to fight or argue against it or even feel it except as a knot in his stomach as he stood in his real parents' kitchen ironing his uniform and thinking of all the ways he could screw up and strike out looking or drop balls out and right and reveal his true pathetic essence in front of this .418 hitter and his witchily pretty sister and everyone else in the audience in lawn chairs and the grass along the sides of the Legion field, all of whom already probably saw through the sham from the outset anyway, he was pretty sure. In other words, David Wallace trying, if only in the second his lids are down, to somehow reconcile what this luminous guy had seemed like from the outside with whatever on the interior must have driven him to kill himself in such a dramatic and doubtlessly painful way. With David Wallace also fully aware that the cliché that you can't ever truly know what's going on inside somebody else is hoary and insipid, and yet at the same time trying very consciously to prohibit that awareness from mocking the attempt, or sending the whole line of thought into the sort of inbent spiral that keeps you from ever getting anywhere. Considerable time having passed since 1981, of course, and David Wallace having emerged from years of literally indescribable war against himself with quite a bit more firepower than he'd had at Aurora West. The realer, more enduring, and sentimental part of him commanding that other part to be silent, as if looking it levelly in the eye and saying, almost aloud, "Not another word."